Hey, have you heard about this case, listeners? My name is Becca.
And I'm Nancy.
And we're the hosts of
Insane Investigations.
If you're a fan of our friends Sam and Kelly on Have You Heard About This Case, then you might enjoy Insane Investigation,
where we cover off all things from true crime, paranormal, and even conspiracy theories.
You can find us anywhere you normally listen to podcasts, and you can follow us on all social media at Insane Investigations.
And we hope you enjoy listening to Have You Heard About This Case?
Hi, anyone and everyone. Welcome to Have You Heard About This Case? My name is Sam.
And my name is Kelly.
Today we will be talking about a case that's pretty monumental to modern day forensics. But before we get into today's episode, let's start with our question. Kelly, what's your question for this week?
I have a question for this week, Sam Query. What is your favorite guilty pleasure movie?
Ooh, that's a really good question. And I've actually been listening to a podcast called Guilty Pleasures a lot lately. That's all about guilty pleasure movies.
We love podcasts.
Oh, that's a really great question.
Do you want me to start with my answer?
Yes.
Because I have it locked and loaded.
Yes, you go first.
My answer is how do I not remember it? Showgirls. Every time Showgirls is on television, I must watch the duration of Showgirls.
I've never seen Showgirls.
You've never seen? Oh my God. It is a masterpiece. A masterpiece in poor filmmaking and decent dancing, but mostly topless. And it's a hoot and a holler and horrible. And every time it's on, I have to watch it.
See, I know a lot of people who kind of have that same thing where it's like they just absolutely love it because they know it's not amazing.
Yeah, exactly. I'm like, this is the worst movie. How did they make this? The whole time I'm watching it, the girl from Saved by the Bell plays like the new stripper. Like,
oh,
I'm like, this is so bad.
I'll have to check it out at some point because that's usually like my type of movie that is just, they're not that good, but they're amazing all at the same time.
Oh, yeah.
I think mine probably is, and partially because it's literally sitting behind my TV, which is right next to me. It is Tower of Terror. It is one of my Halloween classics. I cannot go a Halloween season without watching Tower of Terror.
Okay. Is it a horror movie?
It is a children's horror movie.
Oh, okay.
I don't know what year it's from, but it's based on the ride at Universal or Disney or wherever it is. I'm not sure if it's even a ride anymore. I think they shut it down.
No. Oh, no, it's still a ride. It's in, I don't know if we're allowed to say the name of the park due to rights, but Tower of Terror lives.
Oh, does it? Good, because I loved that ride when I was a kid.
Tower of Terror lives on to master my panic attack every day of my life. I'm never riding that thing.
Oh, I loved it. I was way too young to ride it. I was 5 and I was tall. So I fit the height restriction. But I should not have been on it. And this was the mid-90s. This is before they had like tighter seatbelts. They had this bar.
Exactly.
And I literally floated up.
And they and they also were fully like C- caring about who they let on the rides. They were like, she probably has socks stuffed in her shoes, but yeah, let's put her on the roller coaster.
I was with my parents. My mom had to like put her arm around me because she was so scared because I was literally lifting off of my seat. And they had these TV screens down in the lobby that my grandma was watching on, and my grandma almost had a heart attack. Like, it was bad.
No. Yeah, no, ma'am.
I loved it. I had so much fun.
Oh, my God.
Haven't been on it since, but, you know.
It exists in a theme park owned by a popular mouse, right across the way from a roller coaster by a popular band, who I believe's name we can say, Aerosmith, the rock and roller coaster.
Wait, what?
It is a dope. Yes, girl. The whole roller coaster is a journey through a recording session with Aerosmith.
That's amazing.
So you're in the line and it looks like the back room of a recording area. And they have a video from like Steven Tyler and the band when you're about to go right on. And then this car shoots you from 0 to 60 in 3 seconds. And you go through an indoor roller coaster. Meanwhile, Aerosmith is blasting in your ears. It is the most fun. And I will always be in that line over Tower of Terror.
See, I am now in my 30s. I'm not a fan of roller coasters anymore. I've reached that age. I don't like them. I would go on that in a heartbeat.
It's so fun. It's so fun. There exists a picture of me somewhere. They take your picture right as they go 0 to 60, right?
Oh, that's funny.
So I'm screaming and my eyes are so big. I've never seen my eyes that big in my life. And my father was like, we're buying that. And then he put it on our fireplace for my whole adolescence.
I feel like me and your dad would get along really well based on all of the stories I've heard.
My whole adolescence. They were like, what are you doing in that picture? And I was like, oh, just, fearing for my life.
Oh, that's great. Well, actually, speaking of movies, this is a really fantastic segue into this case because this case actually inspired one of my all-time favorite movies. Now, I'm not going to tell you what that movie is because I want to see if you have the ability to guess at the end. But this is a movie that my family considers one of our favorites. We watch it together about once a year. And hopefully you'll be able to figure it out at the end, or our listeners can figure it out. I guarantee you, if my family's listening to this, they'll immediately know once they hear kind of the little details of this.
Somebody will be yelling out what it is, and
Absolutely.
I'll be like,
But this is the case about Helle Crafts, and it takes place in Newtown, Connecticut in 1986. And let's jump into starting with Helle's background. She was born on July 7th, 1947 as Helle Lork Nielsen in Denmark. I really hope I pronounced her whole name correctly. I am very terrible at that. I tried looking it up. I listened to audio recordings. I hope that is right. But by all accounts...
You did your best.
Yeah, I really did. I really tried. But by all accounts, she was a really great student when she was in high school. She was very well loved. And she had this absolutely incredible ability to learn languages. And in high school, she was able to fluently learn French and English. And she was also able to understand German, Norwegian, and Swedish in high school.
Wow.
I took Latin.
Wow.
When I studied Latin, I don't know anything. I didn't retain anything from Latin. And I took that because I got a trip to Italy and Greece when I was 16. That was it.
I only remember the French that they made me memorize, which all has to do with the French film Jean de Florette. And I am also extremely fascinated by people who have the gift of the gab, who can pick up languages like that. I think that's fascinating.
I have tried so many times to learn other languages. I studied abroad in college. I knew a lot of Italian for a long time. It's all gone. Every bit of it is just gone. And I wish I was able to retain it. But without being surrounded by it, it's hard.
I always get those emails from my Duolingo, like, you made Duo sad because I haven't practiced my Spanish.
I think I turned those off.
It's because it's hard. It's hard. Grammar in any new language is hard. So it's very impressive that she was able to do this.
Especially in high school. Like, I know it can be easier to learn another language when you're younger. But that's a lot. That's so much. And it's an extra talent that I just don't possess.
Yeah.
And when Helle graduated high school, she actually decided to go to college in England. I couldn't quite find what she was studying. But I know after college, she actually went to France to become an au pair. And
okay.
I know it's a lot easier to travel cross countries in Europe because it's so much smaller than the United States.
Yeah.
And it's just so incredible to me as somebody who grew up in the States, how many different cultures that you can experience by, for us, what would be just driving a couple states over, you're able to go to these different countries that speak different languages and have all these different cultures. And that's something that Helle really appreciated about Europe and being able to experience those sorts of things.
That's incredible. I completely see why that would be what she retained. And again, so young.
Exactly.
So just in college and already able to sort of appreciate that cultural dynamic is very wise.
Yeah, and it's something that can easily be taken for granted. And she clearly didn't do that. And she wanted to expand further. And traveling to France was something that was big for her in getting this job outside of something that was comfortable and home. But she even wanted to go further with this. And she actually decided after being an au pair that she wanted to find more of a long-term career that involves travel. And she decided that she was going to apply for a job to be a flight attendant with Capital Airways. And this is the 60s. Flight attendants had to really fit that idyllic image. She was beautiful, blonde. She had this incredibly welcoming smile. A lot of people described her personality as just bubbly and infectious.
So sort of the target demographic at the time for a stewardess.
Exactly. And then Helle ended up hearing about opportunities with Pan Am Airways. And she wanted to apply for that job, which would give her even more ability to travel with a bigger company, something that was a company that was clearly coming up in the airline world. And she knew it was going to be a long shot. Like, this was a widely advertised position. And out of 200 applicants, she was one of 8 chosen to travel to Miami for training.
That's fantastic.
So she clearly was on the right path. She knew what she wanted. And she was willing to literally travel across the world to make it happen for herself. After going to Miami for training, she was staying at this motel with a lot of other airport employees. This motel was really close to the airport, and there was a bus that would take them back and forth between the motel and the airport. So it was just super convenient. A lot of her friends from work all stayed there. And this is where she met her future husband in May of 1969, Richard Crafts.
Okay.
So now let's move on to talk about Richard a little bit. He was born in New York City on December 20th, 1937, and he was raised in Darien, Connecticut. And Darien is one of the most affluent communities in the state. Richard started out at a private high school, but this was something he really struggled with. And he ended up having to transfer to public high school. It's just private high school was not for him.
Fair.
Yeah, exactly. Like, sometimes, we've said this a few times, like college, we've discussed it within college, but college isn't for everybody.
Nah. Sometimes you just don't need it. And with a private high school, I can kind of understand you're probably under a lot of restrictions and, that's not always the best environment.
Well, in that time period as well, everything was very uniform educationally. And a lot of people learn in just very different ways. And that might be more of a struggle in a private high school where they expect you to meet their standards in their specific ways. So I understand that. And even like after high school, when he did go to college, he struggled with that too. And he decided to drop out and he joined the Marines in 1956.
Okay.
And this is where Richard discovered his love of flying. I saw some reports that Richard had worked for Air America, which is a branch of the CIA. And he apparently was the pilot for a few secret missions. Now, a lot of this is secret, confidential information. So I don't know any details about it, but I did see it in a handful of articles. So I think it's a fairly credible thing that he did this.
Mm-hmm.
And then after working with the Marines and the CIA, which took him all around the world, he decided to return to the States in 1966.
Okay.
And
so 10 years of flying, very complicated mission.
Exactly. And apparently he was an incredibly skilled helicopter pilot. So that's where a lot of his work with Air America came in, specifically with helicopters. But it sounds like he was really able to kind of fly anything, and he had a real passion for flying. And then when Richard met Helle in 1969, he was actually engaged to another woman. And he seemed to pretty quickly fall for Helle, but he didn't break up with his fiancée immediately. I did see a handful of reports that said that Richard was kind of known for seeing other women. And I also saw a lot of reports that said that Helle knew this and that she was okay with it.
Okay.
So if she's okay with it, then I don't think there's an argument there.
If she's okay, then she's okay.
Yeah, exactly. I didn't see any reports of her having any other relationships with men with Richard, but it's definitely possible that they just chose to have an open relationship. But their relationship was unfortunately on and off a lot. Some of Helle's friends would say that they would fight and break up, and that sometimes these fights would even be public. And so a lot of people were just witnessing their arguments.
Red flag.
Yeah, and then they would just end up back together, and it would just be this back and forth constant thing with them. And a lot of her friends would say that they didn't really understand what she saw in him, and that they believed that she could have found somebody else, but she just cared for him so much that she always ended up going back with him, despite these constant fights and arguments.
Oh.
And by 1975, Helle and Richard were pregnant with their first child, and they got married in November of that year. And this is also around the time that they bought their first home in Newtown, Connecticut. So they decided to go back there and really start their lives.
Mm-hmm.
And Helle's friends would unfortunately say that it wasn't uncommon for her to have bruises, even on her face, during her pregnancy.
What?
And this is a really big deal to me that I feel like is important to point out, because abuse is something incredibly serious, and based on just what we were saying earlier, the fights being public, that really shows me that Richard wasn't really afraid of anything, and he wanted full control.
Yeah, that's crazy. Facial bruising on a pregnant woman.
And it seemed a pretty good constant, unfortunately, during her pregnancy. A lot of her friends would try to talk her out of it and talk her out of being with him, but she didn't want to leave him. She wanted to have their baby and have this idyllic American life.
Yeah, and I mean, that's why I red flagged it earlier on the public fights, because it just goes to show, like, he doesn't care who sees him losing it on her or anything like that.
Exactly. Within the next couple years, Helle had 2 more kids with Richard, and he continued his work as a pilot, and she was a stay-at-home mom. And this meant that she was alone with the kids a lot. And she loved her kids. And I feel like this had to be a bit of a relief for her, because it has to be difficult to be a single mom, but it also has to be a relief that her abuser is also out of the house.
Is her, during these years with her children, is he continuing to physically harm her?
I believe so. I didn't see a lot of very specific evidence that continued to say that, but it seems like this was a trend. But it sounds like the worst of it potentially was during that first pregnancy, based on a lot of reports. I saw a lot of them say that these bruises were exceptionally bad during the first pregnancy.
Okay. Well, all right. So it's definitely within the realm of possibility that he was continuing to abuse her.
Exactly. But eventually, Helle, she wanted to return to work. She loved her job as a flight attendant. And they decided that they were going to hire an au pair. So they hired Dawn Marie Thomas, who is 19 years old. And she started working pretty quickly with the kids right after Helle wanted to start to return to work. And after she returned to work, Helle and Richard had a combined income of $125,000, which today's standards is, I believe, just shy of $400,000. That's a pretty good income.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Like you're not.
I mean, 3 kids.
Yeah, you're spending a lot of money because you have a big family, you have a home, but at the same time, you're still probably able to save a good amount of money for your retirement, for college funds, for everything for the future.
You're doing pretty good.
Exactly.
You're doing.
But Richard fully controlled their income. He would give Helle an allowance that was barely enough to cover food and household essentials.
Oh my God, red flag.
Yeah, if she needed more money, she would have to tell him exactly what it was for and exactly how much she needed. And then he would approve it and give it to her or not give it to her.
Okay. This is the entire income.
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah, he controlled every cent of it.
What year is... This is 1969, 1970?
This is the mid to late 1970s now. I don't know exactly what year she went to work, but they were pregnant with their first child in 1975. So I think this is a handful of years later.
Okay. Sorry. That just... wow.
Yeah,
that
it's a lot.
He would be in control of her entire salary.
And Richard was not shy of
on her.
Oh, he really did.
A chain on her to have to ask permission to get anything extra.
Even I think about it like
applesauce.
Yeah, or like getting him a toy or something like that. She didn't have a disposable income to do that because he wouldn't give it to her.
That is nasty. I don't like that.
Yeah, there's a lot of things you're not going to like in the future here.
Yeah, I don't like that one bit.
This one I know you're not going to like, just because I know you. One thing he would spend a lot of money on was guns. He had a very extensive gun collection, which was basically a full armory in his house. Dozens of guns and grenades and everything in between. There were people who would say that if there was a gun show in the Northeast, it was guaranteed that Richard would be there buying more for his collection. And then,
what are you so afraid of, Richard?
Well, that's the thing.
That's all.
I personally, I'm not a fan of guns, but I understand people's desire to have guns. I grew up in an area where guns are very, very important to people. And I personally, even though I don't want to have one, I can understand the desire to. I have a lot of friends who are frequently going to the gun range, who are avid hunters. That's different than what this sounds like, in my personal opinion.
Y'all know that maybe if you've heard me talk a little bit, I am the definition of gun shy. I have never shot a gun in my life. However, I do believe that if there is a bear or a mountain lion or a gator or a large animal on your property that you need to take care of, there seems to be an adequate need for a firearm. What I fail to understand is when it turns into a collection kind of armory display, like not even antique guns, but just like all kinds of new crazy killing weapons and you got young kids, that's what tweaks me here more than the gun thing as a whole.
One thing I will say is I saw no evidence that these guns were unsecured in the home. I feel like through all of my research, that's something that would potentially come up just based on everything we're going to continue to say. So
right, and also I should drop just this that everyone who I know who owns a firearm, and I grew up in Ohio, so there's a handful of people who I know who have firearms who handle them absolutely responsibly, keeping them in a lock safe and the ammunition out of the gun, like responsible gun ownership.
Exactly.
I'm all about that.
Yeah, and I feel like the people that I know as well, which I'd say of all the people I grew up with, I'm one of the very, very few that doesn't have guns or a gun locker filled with guns. Like, my sister, she's not a gun person either, but her husband grew up hunting, and they have a fully stocked gun locker. He's only ever used his guns for hunting, but that's just how people are where I grew up.
And the thing is, I'm not going to yuck anybody's yum on collections as long as your collection is properly secured.
Exactly.
Because Sam, you know me well. I collect some stuff that is strange. I collect a lot of weird items.
It's
All
true.
of those items are contained. They are contained in cabinets and under glass so as not to alarm guests. As I think guns should be secured to not alarm guests.
Yeah, and like I said, there's been no evidence that I have seen that anything's unsecured in the home when it comes to his gun collection.
Well, that's...
And I do think that's worth being noted, because I feel like if there were unsecured weapons, I would probably find something in my research, because I will tell you, you can probably tell this already, people don't like this guy. Any reason to get like on his back about anything, I feel like unsecured guns in a home with 3 children is a pretty good thing to mention.
Yeah.
But also, this is reporting from the 70s. So who really knows? Things were different then than they are now. But as a whole, I don't think it's super relevant, but it really adds to what he controlled in this household.
Yeah. I think it just says, it says something about the power and control dynamic.
Exactly.
In this situation.
And another thing he spent a lot of money on was lawn equipment. And this isn't just your lawnmower and weed whacker. This is big lawn equipment. Like backhoes and bobcats. Yeah. And it seemed like he never really used it. But I saw multiple reports saying that he bought all of this high-end lawn equipment. And again, I think it's just he had the ability because he controlled the finances more than anything. I think that's what this was.
Yeah, that seems what it appears to be.
And there were times...
It appears to be.
Yeah, it's just bizarre. I don't really understand, but hey, to each their own. Again, my sister and her husband own a lot of lawn equipment, but they also own a business where they use it every single day. And it's not just lawn equipment.
Well,
they have everything. But it's because they literally use it every day in their business that they own together.
Well, what doesn't red flag me here is like the lawn equipment, even though it's industrial and strange, what really strikes me is the assertion of power and dominance. Like, all the money is mine. I can buy a bulldozer if I want, and you can't have money to feed the kids.
Exactly. That's exactly what this is, in my own opinion, at least.
Yes, in my humble opinion, I offer you that this is a power play. And gross.
Yeah. There were a lot of times that Richard would also disappear from the house. Sometimes it would end up being for work, sometimes these gun shows, but there were many times he wouldn't give any explanation. He would just disappear for a few days at a time, And that
days. Okay, this lady has 3 children.
Yep. And my assumption is these disappearances were him going off with other women. That seems like it was a trend from the very beginning of their relationship. But none of that's officially confirmed. But that seems to be the opinion of a lot of Helle's friends and family. And it seems to make a whole lot of sense, unfortunately. Now, this is where you're going to get more frustrated.
Okay.
In 1982, Richard became an auxiliary officer. And it's not like he needed any more entitlement, but he did this. And for those of you who might not be familiar with the term.
Thank you. I am not.
Oh, yeah,
I am not. I would like thank you for the explanation.
Yeah. For those of you who might not be terribly familiar with the term auxiliary officer, they often work with the police, but they do not have police power.
Okay.
And it's clear to me that Richard really made this position and really got this position just to feel more powerful and boost his own ego. But he wasn't even paid to be an auxiliary officer. One of the most common positions that an auxiliary officer does is to support the police during traffic events. So they're often the people who you see with the vests, and they're often wearing a police uniform or a police-like uniform, and they're helping direct traffic if there's a big sporting event.
Sure.
And they're trying to control traffic flow out of the venue or anything like that. That's often an auxiliary officer. And so they do have obviously very incredibly important jobs, but they're not classified as a police officer.
Right.
And I don't think it comes as any surprise whatsoever that he abused this position.
Oh, dear.
He would often listen to police radios and respond to calls as if he was an officer. He'd hang out at the police station. And in 1985, he actually bought his own Crown Vic with this money that he was keeping from Helle.
Oh, my God.
And he fully outfitted it as if it were a police car. He had radios, antennas, lights, and sirens to this Crown Vic.
Oh, my gosh.
All out of pocket, and he is not a police officer. He is an auxiliary officer in a volunteer position.
Oh, what fresh nonsense is this man doing?
Gets worse.
Okay. All right, I'm ready.
In 1986, he was actually hired as a police officer in a neighboring
I knew
town.
you were going to say that.
Yeah. And so you can already tell his ego is so high.
Yeah. This
was what he was waiting for. And he believed this was his calling. But also remember, he's still a pilot.
Okay.
This is just a part-time position to boost his ego.
Okay. So he's still like actively flying planes and like working in an airport and stuff?
He's still working as a pilot.
Wow,
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, so he becomes a police officer in a neighboring town called Southbury, which is only about 10 miles from Newtown. So it was still very close. And like I said, this was just part-time. But this was also around the time that Helle decided that she wanted a divorce.
Okay.
Her oldest was about 11 years old at this point, and she needed out. And she knew she needed out. So that summer, she took the next steps. She hired a divorce attorney, and she hired a private investigator named Keith Mayo.
Okay.
And she decided to hire the private investigator because she wanted to actually get proof that Richard was cheating on her so she could bring that to the divorce lawyer to make her divorce easier.
Sure.
On November 19th in 1986, Helle returned home to her Newtown house after an international flight, and one of her friends dropped her off at home. And unfortunately, this was the last time anyone saw Helle.
Wait. Okay, she It was on an international flight, dropped her off at home.
Yep. I believe she was returning home from Munich. It was like late at night, so it was probably like early morning after midnight type of thing.
Okay. Oh, okay.
Yeah, like night of the 18th, early morning of the 19th. Okay. So on the morning of the 19th, Dawn, the Crafts au pair, said that Richard woke her up around 6 a.m. and told her that Helle was driving to his sister's house in Westport, which was about 20 miles away. I looked it up on GPS. It said it's about 40 minutes.
Okay.
And Dawn immediately thought this was really bizarre that Helle would leave early and just head out to her sister-in-law's.
Yeah.
But what's even more weird about it is on the night of the 18th, so just the previous night, there was a really intense snowstorm. And when I was reading an article, I actually found an article in the New York Times that talked about this specific snowstorm in the Northeast on that day. And it said that 92,000 homes lost power. And this includes the Crafts home. They did lose power during this storm. But the storm ended around 8 a.m. So he woke Dawn up at 6 a.m. saying that Helle already left. And the snowstorm is still happening
into
outside.
A snowstorm. She left at 6 in the morning into a snowstorm. Okay.
Yeah. And the snowstorm was described as having peak winds as high as 40 miles per hour and having thunder and lightning during the snowstorm. So that's pretty intense.
Yeah.
Basically, all the schools were closed. There was a ton of traffic accidents reported. And this New York Times article just described the roads as ugly and wet.
Ugh.
And I grew up in northern Wisconsin. I know exactly what this feels like.
Me too. Me too.
And
me too.
It's not fun to be driving through this.
It is not. I'm from northeastern Ohio, and I know this as well. And this is not the kind of leisurely drive to visit your sister-in-law.
No, not at all. And so me looking up this GPS route, first off, the roads could have changed because this was 1986. I looked this up today in 2022. Mm-hmm. So there's a good possibility that traffic routes have changed. But it said it was a 40-minute drive, and it's a beautiful day out. I would imagine that drive being well over an hour in that sort of weather.
Yeah, well over. Because there are certain times where, like, in a storm like this, you have to pull over underneath a bridge.
So obviously this is weird that Richard would say that Helle would be traveling alone. Mm-hmm. I think that's another big part of it.
Yeah.
And it sounds like Richard wanted Dawn to take the kids early to also go to his sister's home because their house had no power. So by 6:30 a.m., Richard had woken up their au pair, Dawn, and both of the kids and was on the way driving them to his sister's house.
Oh.
Again, this is before the storm actually stopped. Like, I'm sure it's petering out at this point. It's not as intense as the 40-mile-an-hour winds at this point. But one thing I do know, especially with these like super late night storms, those roads are not super clear at that point.
Nah.
Like there could be some decent plowing happening because they do plan for this. I know where I grew up, plows were absolutely out and about before storms ended. But this sounds like it was a pretty intense storm that needed a lot of extra work to clear the roads.
Yeah, I mean, if it made the New York Times, like, that's going to require some serious maintenance.
Exactly. And Dawn didn't mention how long this drive took them, but she did say once they arrived at his sister's house, he basically just dropped her and the kids off and just left right away.
Okay.
And now, remember, Helle's supposed to be at Richard's sister's house because she left before everyone.
Right.
She wasn't there.
Ooh. Yeah.
So later that night, Richard returns to his sister's house around 7 p.m. And there was no point throughout the day that Helle had shown up there.
Oh.
When Donna had asked Richard where she was, he responded, "I don't know."
Cool. Great husband.
Right?
Great husband.
And I get it. No cell phones, any of that.
That's true.
But
no cell phones.
You'd show a little more concern.
Right. You
she's not here.
What do you mean? I should probably start worrying about that more.
Yeah. And then once they got back to the house, one thing that she noticed pretty quickly was that a piece of the carpet from their bedroom was missing.
Okay.
And I think you can probably tell exactly what the assumptions are there.
Mm-hmm.
Dawn started asking questions.
Yeah.
And when she asked about the carpet, he said that he had spilled kerosene on it and it needed to be replaced.
Okay.
Yeah.
Kerosene.
So I'm starting to think, I'm like, okay, kerosene, that's kind of bizarre. And then I go to the thought of okay, there was no power. Maybe they had a kerosene lamp or something like that.
That would be, I guess, a justifiable reason to have kerosene. But for me, I'm short and
That's the only thing I can come up with.
I'm short and I'm unable to make that reach. I don't know why you would have a whole patch of your carpet covered in kerosene, my guy. Yeah,
well, also just the immediate, okay, I spilled this. I guess it's just time to cut it up and throw it out.
I guess I better cut up this whole hunk of carpet and just pitch it.
Yeah, so that's weird. And there were a lot of questions coming from friends and family of where she is because people just hadn't heard from her for a while. And it was actually eventually Keith Mayo, the private investigator that Helle hired, who actually reported her missing.
Wow.
I'm not sure exactly what date this was. I just saw reports of that he was the one to report her missing. But this had to have happened fairly quickly. Because it was on December 4th that Richard had actually agreed to take a lie detector test. So my assumption is that they had been in conversations at least for a day or two to get to the point where he's coming in for a lie detector. Yeah. If not a week or a good chunk of time before that. But he agreed to come in and he agreed to take this lie detector test. And one thing that I'm not sure if we've covered in this podcast yet is the discussion of lie detector tests. And I think it's fairly common knowledge now in the true crime world that we don't trust lie detector tests. They are not historically accurate. They can no longer be used in court. But I will say there is something that comes along with the immediate willingness to take one. Again, it could mean absolutely nothing. But I think that there are times where it can be said, okay, if you're willing to do anything it takes to find your missing wife, that's typically a good sign. I don't know about that in this case. And I think that there's a lot of evidence we've already discussed that a lot of you will agree.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, props for showing up for the lie detector test, but I don't know how this is going to turn out for him.
Well, he passed.
Really?
Yep.
Okay.
And at this point, he was cleared of any involvement in Helle's disappearance.
Okay.
Not every investigator did believe he was innocent, though. Between Dawn's comments about the odd events that happened on November 19th, and then the constant friends of Helle calling into the police department asking for updates on the investigation and pointing fingers towards Richard.
Okay.
There were investigators who just really couldn't shake the feeling that he was still involved despite being cleared by other investigators. But
I mean, a lot of that could be the lie detector too. You know, maybe people are, thinking that lie detector, may not have caught everything. And they would be ahead of their time in thinking that.
Exactly. And I think this was around the time that it started to come a little more into question. Mm-hmm. But I do believe lie detectors were still being used as evidence at this point, which is why he was officially cleared after taking one. But unfortunately, because there was no any actual tangible evidence that he was involved in her disappearance, there was nothing they could really do at this point.
Okay, because...
So then...
We also, we have the problem here so far of plausible deniability, no body, no homicide.
Exactly. So now let's jump to December 11th. Investigators decide to call Richard back in for more questioning. And Richard was actually working a night shift at the Southbury Police Department. Oh. So they just called over his supervisors and asked if they just could send him over so they can do further questioning. And his supervisors were like, oh, yeah.
Convenient.
No issue. Go.
Convenient.
Leave.
Yeah. Go over there.
So he actually arrived at the police station to be questioned around 9:20 that night in uniform.
Okay.
One of the first questions that he was asked was that if he was aware that Helle had hired a private investigator. He said no. Mm-hmm. So they told him that this investigator, Keith Mayo, had evidence that he was having an affair with a woman from New Jersey. They asked why her friends would say that Helle was scared to serve him the divorce papers, and why Helle had asked for them to check on her periodically to make sure nothing happened to her.
Oh, wow.
And he said he can't imagine her ever saying anything like that, and it was completely out of her character.
Oh. Yeah. So
now investigators started to ask about her timeline. Mm-hmm. And they asked him why she left on the night of the 18th, 19th, kind of late night, and just never returned home. His response was, those answers are in my statement.
Wait, and he's referring to the statement he made where he knows...
Just prior to this one, where it's the lie detector, kind of all of that, where he's like, he knows nothing.
Okay. Oh, yes.
He's just like, those answers are my statement. He won't answer their question.
Okay, so
it's just, those are in my statement.
He won't give a real, statement. He's just relying on the lie detector test.
Basically.
Okay. All right, cool. I just wanted to check.
Yeah. Well, I think that comment in general is just egotistical. It's like, oh, it doesn't matter. Just read what I gave you before.
Exactly.
Who cares? Just let me go. I'm better than this type of attitude.
Yeah, especially for a police officer, when you're dealing with other police officers, it strikes me...
Exactly. There's no respect.
It strikes me as quite a narcissistic trait and a little, just like you said, it doesn't show any respect. And you would think you would want to show your fellow officers respect in this scenario. In order to make yourself look good solely. You're not looking great right now.
Right? They then asked him about the rugs. And he said all the rugs in the house were being replaced. And that, he did spill some kerosene on one of them in the bedroom. And he decided he was going to cut everything up into 2 feet pieces to make it easier to remove.
Okay. All right. That's I got a bridge in London to sell ya if that's your plan.
Yeah. So then they went on to ask him why he started telling people that Helle decided to go to Denmark because her mother was sick. And he's like, oh, well, I just didn't want to tell him I didn't know where she was. So he started telling people, her friends, oh, she just left for Denmark. So he started lying to people about it.
Previously it was, I don't know where she is. Right? And now it's, she went to Denmark in the middle of the night.
Yeah, and his excuse for saying this to people was just because he didn't want to start telling people he didn't know. So he just came up with a lie.
Which is bonkers if someone is missing. Like, yo, just tell the truth.
Mm-hmm. So now let's jump back to Keith Mayo a little bit and talk about his investigation that he was doing. He's the one who reported her missing because, again, that she had asked for check-ins. And when Keith checked in with her and she didn't respond, he knew something was up. And he immediately suspected Richard because that's why he was hired. He was hired to figure out what Richard was doing behind her back so she could get away from him.
Yeah.
So he's talking to Helle's friends and family, and they all said that they don't trust Richard and that he was acting suspicious. And that they were all getting different explanations for where Helle was. He used that Denmark mother excuse a few times. He said a couple other times that she was on another international flight for work, which boggles my mind that he would use this as an explanation, because it is protocol when you have an international flight to have, I think it's 48 hours off in between flights. Because you can't just go back to back and go onto another long international flight like that.
Absolutely.
And so she was coming home from a international flight that night. She wouldn't immediately the next morning leave for another one.
No.
And he should know this as a pilot.
Absolutely. Like, and I'm not a pilot. And I know that you can't work a crew on back-to-back international flights. There's a mandatory rest period. Like, even I know that.
Yeah. And another excuse he used quite a bit was that Helle was in the Canary Islands with one of her friends. And he was actually naming this friend. She wasn't with him. She wasn't with Helle.
In the Canary Islands?
Yeah. So now, once Keith heard about Dawn's experience with the carpet pieces, seeing that those were gone, he immediately believed those carpet pieces contained blood evidence, which I assume was your first thought. It was definitely my first thought.
Yep.
And Keith would not let this go. He went through as much evidence as he could. He tried to go through the interviews and interrogations with Richard, and realizing that there wasn't anything that really led to any physical evidence. And he knew that was so important. And he managed to track down the dump where Richard potentially dumped these pieces.
Oh, go Keith.
With a handful of helpers, he dug around this dump for days.
Wow.
Until he found the carpet piece.
Wow.
There were large stains on it. They did look like blood, so he sent them off for testing with the police. Because he is working in tandem with the police.
Okay.
He's trying to make sure everything is done right in this case.
Sure. Okay, that would have been a very good question on my part. I wasn't sure if he was working entirely for Helle.
He is, like, he was hired by her, but he truly believed, basically immediately, that Richard had murdered Helle. And he was getting frustrated that there was just no evidence. So he took it upon himself as an investigator to try to find it. And then the moment he found anything, the police were immediately looped in. Testing was done through the police department as it needs to be for any sort of potential future trials or anything like that. He wanted to make sure that everything was done by the book.
That's fantastic.
So now this is mid-December. And the police were trying to help guide the news through this missing persons case, but they didn't really want to provide a ton of detail. And we've seen this before. You don't want to give away too much to the media. And I think that there's a lot of modern day examples that are really proving how harmful, but at the same time, how beneficial it could be. So it's a very difficult line to be walking.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a tightrope.
And exactly. And while the police are being really tight-lipped, Keith Mayo is not.
Okay.
He wants to get the information out there, and he is basically saying, like, as the police are saying, she's a missing person. They're not saying any sort of foul play or any harm has done to her, that she is missing. Okay. He's like, she didn't disappear on her own accord. Mm-hmm. He's really pushing that narrative as much as he could. And at the same time, he's being very critical of the police in the public's eye. Mm-hmm. And there's good reasons for this. Like, they are trying. Obviously, we're talking a little earlier about investigators not buying that he was cleared with this lie detector, and there were still people questioning his involvement. But again, if you don't have that concrete evidence, it's really hard to force anything. Yeah. Like, you want the evidence to speak for itself. You don't want to try to place evidence in anyone's hands.
Yeah, it's so difficult when you just hit the wall of there being no physical evidence. And I mean, it just goes to show even more the level of planning this crime, Chuck.
Oh, just wait. We'll get there. But one thing as well, Richard works for the police department. Yeah. Keith had no idea whether there was a potential cover-up or not. So he wanted his voice heard and his beliefs heard so that it's not being just pushed aside and ignored. And this is before internet. This is before all of that. So your real only way to say this is directly to the news.
Yes.
And one thing that was going to prove to be fairly difficult is DNA.
Yeah.
So they sent this carpet piece out to try to get it tested for blood and do all these different things. But remember, this is 1986. Like, DNA isn't really a thing at this point. They don't know how to test for DNA yet. They can test blood types and see a few things. Okay. But there's no concrete evidence when it comes to the DNA testing. Right. But Keith he wasn't the only one who was very critical on the local police. Eventually, there was a lot of criticism being given from all angles. And the state's attorney office actually wanted to take jurisdiction from the local police and give it to state police.
Oh. So that...
But again, there's not really a ton of evidence with this. The carpet is still being tested, so none of that's come back yet. But there's nothing concrete to say, yes, he's involved, or no, he's not involved. They're just kind of at a standstill at this moment.
Right.
And they didn't want to hand over the case. They wanted to try to solve her disappearance and keep it locally, which I feel like is a pretty common attitude.
Yeah,
in a case like this.
It's rough because we see this dynamic happen a lot when state authorities are called in over local authorities, you know?
Exactly. Eventually, the testing did come back on the rug. And unfortunately, they were unable to confirm whether the staining found on the rug was human blood.
Okay.
But this also means they didn't rule it out. They just weren't able to confirm anything. So unfortunately, they're really kind of just back at square one.
Oh my God.
And at this point, the media is all over the case, and Helle's friends are relentless. They continue to call the police station constantly for updates.
I love it.
They didn't stop.
I love it.
And with nothing happening in this case and them not being able to find anything, they were actually forced to hand over the case to state police because they couldn't find any more leads.
All right. Sometimes you got to move the needle.
It was at this point.
You got to move the needle yourself. You got to move the needle yourself. If they're not going to do it, then you got to keep calling. I love that.
They refused to stop. So now the state police are involved, and they started by pulling the Crafts credit card statements. And remember, Richard gave Helle an allowance, so it should be pretty simple to determine who was spending what money. A few things that they noticed on the billing month of Helle's disappearance was the purchase of a large capacity freezer on November 17th. The records show that the freezer was purchased and picked up in the same day, the day before Helle returned from her work trip. And in the same billing period, there was a rental of some sort of machinery from Darren Rentals for $900. And they also saw that there was a purchase of new sheets and comforter for the master bedroom.
Okay, so there's a lot to be troubled about there. I am really troubled about what type of machinery this was.
Yes.
That's very troubling. Even given the first thing, that is extremely troubling. Because large capacity freezers, God help me if I ever stumble upon one, I never want to find one because I don't want to open it. I don't want to know what's in there. And so all of that,
well, what gets
all of
me
that is
is
chilling.
The day that was
exactly.
purchased.
All of that is chilling. Not only was it purchased, it was picked up that same day. So he was like, I gotta go get this chest freezer. Like, that is so insane.
Yeah, that's those were three really big call outs that were made on that one billing statement.
Yeah, I see why.
So finally, there is some evidence that the police can use to get a search warrant. And the search warrant stated the following. Based on their experience and training, that crimes of violence involve struggle, a break, the use of weapons, other instrumentalities, and or the element of unpredictability. That the person participating in the commission of a violent offense is in contact with physical surroundings in a forceful or otherwise detectable manner. That traces may be left in the form of blood, physiological fluids and secretions, hair fibers, fingerprints, or palm prints. Which, to me, this means that they're looking at Richard's personality, statements from other people, and potential evidence that he has harmed Helle in the past to bring forward a search warrant based on these purchases.
Yeah.
It's a pretty big assumption, but they got their search warrant.
Hey, I mean,
it did exactly what it needed to do.
Yeah, it did.
They got the warrant that they were asking for.
It did.
But I found that a very interesting description that they put in the warrant of why they needed it.
Yes.
So on Christmas Day, Richard has the kids in Florida. The police executed this search warrant on Christmas Day.
Merry Christmas! Bunghole!
Police found his gun collection and a large freezer. They took the dozens of guns into evidence and they searched the freezer. They fully expected to find Helle in this freezer, but they didn't.
Okay.
It seems like this freezer was just a freezer.
Okay.
One thing they did notice during their search warrant was that there was a small amount of blood on the mattress in Richard and Helle's bedroom.
Oh.
They did do a luminol test to see if there was any more blood in the house, and it came back positive, specifically in the bedroom. But again, DNA testing is not really a thing.
Right, it's not.
So the only thing that they were able to determine from this was that it was the same blood type as Helle's.
Okay, yeah.
But they still had no idea what happened to her or where she was, and they still needed to find her. So by this time, the investigators had received more information on what this $900 rental equipment was.
Okay.
It was for a large wood chipper.
I knew it.
Richard had rented a wood chipper and a truck on November 19th. And investigators had also received a tip that seemed to come in fairly randomly from somebody named Joseph Hine. He had come forward and said that he saw a truck with a wood chipper on a bridge over a river near Southbury in the middle of the night when he was out plowing the roads for the city after the storm. Richard took investigators to the area where he saw this wood chipper, and investigators actually did see a pile of wood chips on the riverbank. Mm-hmm. Investigators knew that they needed to hurry because another winter storm was on their way.
Okay.
So they immediately went down, started their initial search of the area before the storm hit. And as they were going through the wood piles, they saw more than just wood. They found pieces of green plastic and shredded paper. On one of those pieces of shredded paper, they could read Miss Helle L. Crafts, 5 Newfield Lane, Newtown, Connecticut. It was a piece of mail. So this immediately gives them evidence that at least some of her belongings are in this area.
In a wood chipper in the middle of the night. And why would one dispose of such documents in such a manner?
Exactly. So this was obviously enough for them to immediately call a full forensics team to the area.
Seems fair.
And during the search, they found some evidence that continued to prove that this area was involved in her disappearance in some way, shape, or form. They found more of her mail, fabric, plastic, blonde hair strands, bone fragments, along with some unidentified material. Every single piece that they could find was taken into evidence, and the river was searched at least a mile in both directions to make sure they gathered as much as possible that could have potentially spread between the storms. After now, this is a few weeks after her disappearance. They wanted to get everything. And while this search is still underway at the river, investigators went to the rental agency to get a copy of the rental contract and to see if they could get their hands on the wood chipper for more forensic testing.
Okay, yeah.
Luckily, the rental company had the machine sitting in their back lot.
Yes.
So investigators were able to take it and start testing. And they actually had the ability to lower the water level of this river by creating a temporary dam because it was actually too cold and dangerous for divers to stay in the water for long periods of time during the search. And this ended up being an absolute benefit because they found a chain that was used on a chainsaw in the river. They also found a fragment of a toe.
Oh my God.
Fragment of a finger and a chipped tooth.
Holy shoot.
Yeah. After a couple weeks of the searching, they found a total of 2,660 strands of blonde hair.
God.
69 slivers of human bone, 5 droplets of human blood. I'm not entirely sure what that is on, but it seemed very specifically called out. They found 2 teeth, a truncated piece of skull, 3 ounces of human tissue, a portion of a human finger, 1 fingernail, and a portion of a toenail. This is when they knew they finally found Helle.
This is so gruesome. And the other thing that strikes me immediately is so disrespectful. Like, I can't think of anything that ever deserved the charge of abuse of a corpse more. Like, it's just...
When I was researching this, I couldn't... It was hard for me to really understand any thought process during any of it.
Yeah.
Like, I don't think I could ever empathize with any aspect of Richard in any of this.
No.
And there are some cases that we research where it's like you hear about some troubled experiences growing up that could impact how somebody has turned into the person that they became, and you have a little bit of empathy that has the ability to come with that. There's none here, in my opinion.
I mean, he's hardly earned it. Frankly.
He grew up privileged.
Frankly.
He grew up in a very wealthy community. He struggled in school, but that's absolutely no reason to ever escalate to anything like this.
Right. I struggled with algebra.
There's nothing in his background that shows that something caused him to become this person.
Yeah. And background wise or not, I can't comprehend this level of disrespect for another human being. The mother of your children. I mean, not to make that a point, but someone you were married to. Just, it's the most disrespectful way you could ever handle that.
Well, there's the whole conversation of nature versus nurture.
Yeah.
This is a nature example. 100%, in my opinion. This was clearly in his nature, and no one nurtured this behavior.
Yeah.
So now on January 11th, police obtained the arrest warrant and surrounded Richard's home at 9 p.m. They called him and told him to surrender and come outside. Richard's response was, "I'm tired. I'll take care of it in the morning."
Your arrest? You're going to take care of being taken into custody in the morning?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Sir, I don't think that's how any of this works. Sir.
Yeah.
Sir, from what I understand, you're surrounded. I think you're going to come out right now.
No, yeah, he was fully surrounded. The house was surrounded. So police obviously insisted, said you have to come out.
You're sure gonna.
This made Richard angry. He shouted, "Don't call me back," and hung up on him.
Oh. Can we
the entitlement of this man.
We backtrack for a minute, everyone, and remember what Richard's career is?
Yeah.
And
as a police officer, you would think he'd know a little bit better.
And you yelled, "Don't call me back," and hung up. You're lucky they didn't shoot your house full of holes, sir.
Well, his kids were in the house.
Oh, dear. Okay, so...
Which was a really big reason they wanted him to come outside.
Okay. Yeah.
So, obviously, the police are not going to come back in the morning. They want him out now. So, they just kept calling him. They just kept ringing. And eventually, around 2:30 a.m., Richard told the police, "I'll be out in 5 minutes." Surprisingly, he did come outside within a few minutes, and he was arrested, and he was held on a $750,000 bail.
Boom, Richard. Taste that $750,000 in the 80s money.
Exactly.
Get wrecked, Richard.
Richard would continue to claim his innocence. But police at this point really started to get a full picture of what had happened. They believe that Helle was murdered in the bedroom by Richard based on the blood from the carpet and the blood that was found on the mattress. They believed that he had bought the new freezer, put her in it, most likely in the basement, and this is where he had stored her body. But then when the power went out after that big storm, he started to panic. And that's why he woke Dawn and the kids up and got them out of the house.
To the sister-in-law's
by
home.
6:30 in the morning.
Okay.
His sisters.
His sisters.
Yeah, Helle's sister-in-law.
Yeah. Okay.
Mhm.
Okay.
So that's all making a lot more
sure
sense.
Is.
And when he immediately left his sister's house and just dropped Dawn and the kids off, seems like he probably went back home and dismembered Helle's body, wrapped her in plastic bags, and put her back in the freezer. They believe that this is when he then went and got the wood chipper, and he potentially took this wood chipper around to different areas around Connecticut to dispose of her.
What?
It is also believed that when Richard was on that bridge in the middle of the night and Joseph Hines saw him, he was actually running actual wood through the wood chipper to try to get rid of any remaining evidence that might remain on the internal mechanics of the wood chipper. What he didn't realize is this is the exact evidence that supports his case. Now, let's jump to his trial. Experts testified that 65 bone fragments were cut and crushed by the same machine. This was the bone fragments that they found along the river. And this wasn't a saw. This wasn't anything that would be medical related. And they testified that they believe that this damage was caused by the wood chipper itself. They also were able to use the chain from the chainsaw that they found in the river. They did find that the serial number was scraped off. But they were able to determine that the blade had multiple strands of hair, human tissue, and blue fibers that were the same as the rug from their home in the bedroom. And the forensics lab was actually able to recover the serial number from the blade, even though it had been scraped off. There's a lot of times that that's imprinted so deep that they can still determine that. And this is something that blows my mind and is absolutely incredible. Helle had given Keith Mayo a box of random paperwork. In this box was a receipt from the chainsaw purchased in 1981, 5 years before this all happened. For that chainsaw, they were able to trace back using the serial number and this receipt. Mind-blowing that she gave her private investigator this box of paperwork to try to track down his infidelity.
And she's handing him exactly what he needs to help her.
Exactly. Two other really big pieces of evidence that prosecutors used during the trial were 2 pieces of tooth fragments, one of which had part of the jaw attached to it. And they were able to determine that this was not moved by a dentist. This was not surgically with the way that the bone was fractured. So this also led to proof that this was the wood chipper. And then the second tooth fragment had a crown in it. So they were able to determine through dental records that this crown did belong to Helle. So they didn't need DNA for any of this. Which that's why this was so monumental forensically, because this is actually the first time in Connecticut history that they were presenting a case like this. Without a body.
And those, I mean, just, of late recently, we know how difficult it is to prove your case without a body. Which, I mean, in this case, they all but have the body. With
they have enough
with
evidence
these teeth,
where
with these teeth, they all but have the body.
Yeah, well, their argument was that, look at all the evidence that we have. It's not possible for her to be living.
Right.
With this evidence. But for 2 weeks, the jury deliberated.
Okay.
When they returned, 11 of the 12 jurors wanted to convict Richard, but one juror was unable to agree. This led to a mistrial. The remaining jurors, they would tell reporters that this one juror who refused to convict was just stubborn, and it was like they were working with a child.
Oh.
One was even quoted saying, "It wasn't chaos, it was hell."
Great. Can't imagine a better person to be on a jury with for a murder trial than someone worked.
And for 2 weeks deliberating. That's a long time.
That is a long time.
Like, I understand it. It's a trial has not been done like this before. The way that this evidence is presented, this is hard to hear.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that had to be very difficult as a juror to try to keep track of everything and trust that this wasn't necessarily new science, but it was newly presented in this way.
Right.
That had to be difficult, and I understand that. But there's so much evidence here.
Yeah.
That seemed to really prove that without a reasonable doubt, he is the one who did this.
Yeah.
And this one juror just refused to look at it in that way.
Right.
So now, a few months later, they're back in court again for his second trial. And the prosecutors presented nearly the exact same case.
Good.
Which doesn't always happen during a mistrial as well. Usually they change their tactics and they try to present things in different ways, so they find different experts.
It's true.
They didn't want to do that here. They really believed the way that they presented the case the first time was the correct way. So now this time the jury deliberated for 8 hours.
Okay.
And they found Richard guilty.
Yep.
He was sentenced to 50 years in prison.
Yep.
And this was the first time in Connecticut history that somebody was convicted for murder without the presence of a body.
Wow.
This was a really big deal. And this
is.
was huge news in that this is now early 1987 that this is all happening.
Yeah. And I mean, justice for Helle. You know, like all proven through forensics.
Well, I guess actually I'm wrong. This was not early 1987. This trial happened 3 years after. So this was 1989.
Okay.
But he was arrested within about a month and a half after her disappearance. So this took 3 years to come to trial twice now for his official conviction. So he's sentenced to 50 years in prison in 1989.
Nice.
In January of 2020, Richard was released from prison.
Oh.
He's 87 years old, and he was moved into a homeless shelter for veterans, which really is acting more so as a transitionary home for him because he still is under parole. He still has strict guidelines he has to follow. But he was actually released from prison early due to a policy that is no longer in place in the Connecticut prison system.
Great.
Since he was considered a model prisoner and that he took part in a prison work program, he had this ability with this old policy to have time removed from his sentence. I believe it was a total of 18 years that was removed.
Wow. 18.
Yeah.
That is preposterous.
I will say he's almost 90 years old being released from prison.
Preposterous.
But yeah, that's a lot of time. So as we were saying earlier, this case was incredibly monumental when it comes to the forensic world. And the first time in Connecticut that someone was convicted for murder without a body. This case was so monumental that it actually became the first episode ever of Forensic Files.
I love Forensic. Well, we all know.
Episode 1
we all know I love
of season 1.
Of course I love Forensic Files. I love it.
So now I'm going to return to the original thing I said at the beginning of this episode. What movie do you think this inspired?
Oh. Let me think.
I have a couple hints if you need them.
What do you think?
And I don't even have it written in the script, which I know you have in front of you.
I don't know. Help.
The movie was released in 1996.
Okay.
It was written and directed by the Coen brothers. And it takes place in Minnesota.
Nice. Your girl hasn't seen enough movies.
Oh, then next time you and I are together, I am forcing you to watch
People
this.
People are going to be screaming.
Because it is Fargo.
And
it's such a good movie.
Okay. Yes. I remember this movie. I remember the marketing campaign for it. I remember many things about this. But yes, we'll have to watch it because...
Okay, I'm bringing it with me the next time you and I are together. This is actually one of my family's Christmas movies. We are a very morbid family, but I think it was on TV a few years ago when we were cooking for Christmas dinner. So we just put it on, and it is now a staple in my household that we watch Fargo every year.
I love it. My dad and I used to have a tradition that on Christmas Eve, when nothing else was really going on, we would go see a really violent movie. And it worked out for the first 3 years because the Lord of the Rings movies kept coming out.
Oh, there you go.
But then afterward, it didn't pan out as well because horror is scary.
Yeah, our other staple Christmas movie in my family is Lethal Weapon.
A good one.
So we have a pretty violent Christmas going on in my family as well.
You gotta spice up the holidays.
My dad just thought it was really funny when you ask a 5-year-old girl what her favorite Christmas movie was, and her answer was Lethal Weapon.
He was like,
and we loved it.
He was like, I hope they ask her in school. I can't wait for the day they ask her in school.
We had, this was the 90s. Childhoods were very different than they are today. But you know what? I loved it.
It's good.
I loved every second of it.
It's good.
All right. Well, thank you for listening to Have You Heard About This Case? You can find us on Instagram at Have You Heard About This Case Pod, or you can email us at haveyouheardaboutThisCase@gmail.com. Thank you, and we'll talk to you later.
Talk to you later.